I'm Alan Bourne at Marty, and thank you for joining us for our latest podcast. In today's session, we'll be focusing on how to buy an assessment platform for your organisation. And I'm delighted to introduce Rob Reed, Global Head of Assessment Solutions at LHH, to share his experiences with us. So, Rob, welcome, and could you share a little bit about yourself and your focus at LHH?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for having me on, Alan. Delighted to be here. My focus at LHH as Global Head of Assessment Solutions is to buy in and use the best assessment tools that we can to drive client needs and client outcomes. We deliver more than 30,000 assessments per year to leaders across a number of different use cases. So we work in the talent acquisition space and also the talent management space. LHH is well known in the development space, so we run a number of different development programs, designs, modules, custom program designs. So we have a lean towards talent management in particular, which I know is a bit different from your world, Alan, in terms of where your background and experience has been. But LHH very much focuses, I'd say, primarily in the development space, but we also do some succession and selection work as well globally around the world. We're an organisation of 12,000 people, so we're quite big, and sometimes people don't actually think that we're that big in terms of an organisation. LHH has got a number of different business lines, so we focus on recruitment, career transition, and leadership development, which is where a lot of our assessment work takes place around the world for our customers. And we use a number of different assessments to deliver what we do to our different customers. We also have some homegrown assessments as well in terms of things that we develop, but we also use the best of what's available out there in the market space. And so we're often very much looking at the external market, what's happening and changing in terms of innovation, who's making the recent investments. And we've also done some recent work at looking at the kind of provider market, which I think is really interesting to help other people out there looking at what are other assessment providers doing, how do we make the best selection. And often it's a case of how do you get a great combination? It's not just necessarily a one-stop shop. It connects a bit into your maturity index work, Alan, that you've been doing at Matty's about where do people kind of sit on that continuum and that curve, and how do you therefore make a great selection and choice?
And thank you, Rob, for sort of painting the canvas there. And I think as you were describing in LHH, you've got quite a range of needs. And I think that's why I thought this would be a really interesting opportunity to share the experience that you guys have been through fairly recently, looking at what's the right assessment platform to run all of these things on, and to sort of share some of the lessons. You know, we know there are many facets, as you were sort of describing, at what you would be looking for in a good platform, and we know that things like AI are starting to influence that. So you sort of alluded to it in your intro, but could you describe the main sort of needs or use cases that you were seeking to address at LHH when you went to market recently, and how that might relate to other people?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I alluded to, we focus a lot on the development space, in particular for leaders. You know, that's our primary market space that we continue to work with. So mid-level, senior leadership space and executives around the world. So we've been looking at how do we select a new provider to be able to help us take our new IP and content to market related to leadership. It was an opportunity for us to take a bit of a fresh view at the world, so not to necessarily just regress to the partners that we're already using whilst they've got their strengths and qualities. A lot has changed. So some of the assessments that we've been using and the providers we've put in place have been running now for as long as 5 years. Some things have dramatically changed in 5 years. We've obviously been through lots of different rides. A number of different assessment providers have now become private equity owned as well. So therefore, they're receiving injections of cash, money, new strategies, pressure on those organizations to grow, evolve. What's that doing to the assessment market space? Where are they pushing that money in? How's that then translating into value to customers and clients? That's what's really important for me when I started looking at this, was about how do we get a better and fresh perspective on what they're doing?
Yeah.
What does that mean for what we can do in the value chain for customers as well? So how does that translate into a great experience to a participant, to a candidate, to a team, to a leader, to the exec? And that's what we were really looking at, is a fresh evaluation of the market space. What can we really learn from doing so? And then how do we think about a forward plan for the next 3 to 5 years? How does that then correlate with what our trajectory should look like as an organization? That's what we were really evaluating.
Yeah, sure. And that's really interesting to sort of unpack that, because from your perspective, you've got your customer need, as it were, and then you've obviously got your customer's need to sort of factor in. So there's quite a lot of breadth that needs to factor into that. So could you sort of unpack for us what were the main factors or criteria that you considered, and just tell us a bit about how you looked at each of those when you were evaluating the options that were out there?
Yeah. So firstly, the first thing is you've definitely got to focus on the customer, right? You've got to think
Yeah.
about what the customer's experience is. What are they asking us that they were really looking for? So before I get into what did we ask for, we've got to reflect on what did the customers ask for first, and the clients. So some of the kind of key points around that is test and reuse cases, especially for large enterprise customers. They were coming to us and they've now got less budget. They've still got high targets and high growth in terms of what they've got to achieve out of that money. And many customers are coming to us and saying, we need to assess once and use multiple times to deliver lots of different pieces of the value chain in talent management. So an entry to development, an entry into potential identification, into talent pooling, and then potentially into a fourth stage. So I've spoken to at least 5 or 6 large organizations, like FTSE 100 organizations, that are looking at that in particular. So that was a real focus for us, is how do we get more, test once, use multiple times, get more value from an assessment process.
And Rob, on that point, is there a skills based angle to that, or is it a bit broader, that there's just that desire to be more holistic?
No, there absolutely is. The skills-based angle still very much comes up in many of the different conversations that we're having. I think for the larger organisations, that question is still very complex to unpack in terms of how they attack that. Maybe that's for another podcast, Alan, but there's different ways to look at doing so. Creating taxonomy of skills for the organisation, for functions, for roles, becomes quite complicated in terms of how they do that. But yes, looking at how we can get some level of integration into places where people work every day, and that to translate into an easy way for people to compare and understand the skills of people, especially for things like mobility plays, is still very much a focus for what clients are looking for today. But again, I think organisations are still very much finding their way with the world of skills and the vast array of skills that apply across organisations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Some of the other things that people were really asking for is data on platform. So like, how do we get things out of PDFs into much more interactive models that people can play with? Moving away from classic PDF reports in particular. PDFs, I think, will always have some level of play, especially for kind of high touch processes where paper and pencil is still very much needed to actually play a good role. And just to get to the point quickly, there's a lot of data in assessments. In particular, some providers, it can be hundreds of scales generated out of one single assessment. How do we get to the point of what the assessment is really kind of telling us? What's the insights for me? Platforms are much better at doing so. So being able to get to kind of quickly annotated development areas, strength spaces, linkages to other kind of destination roles, that kind of mobility play. So, you assess a bit like this. We think that this could be a great destination role for you. Let me tell you a bit more about that. That's exactly what organisations are really looking for. And to kind of do that in a high degree of automation related to doing so.
And it's interesting you say that, because I can recall working with colleagues, even though, maybe even 10 years ago, saying, can we stop doing this PDF thing, guys? There must be a better way. But it's interesting that the genuine demand sounds like it's growing for making the data a lot more accessible and actionable, right?
Yeah, well, hold that thought. So let's just think about some of the factors and evaluations that we were looking at LHH based upon the client voice. The first is the measurements have still got to be the basis for a great and sound assessment experience. They still need to be fair, valid, reliable. The origins of great assessments in science still very much have to sit as the bedrock of running a practice, especially if you're using it for selection, right? It has to absolutely be there. Absolutely. It's paramount. So therefore, we saw that as being the first important piece of criteria, is who delivers the best measurement results and who's got the best grounding for all of those kind of really important components for assessment. The next is the digital experience, which links to the potential retirement one day of PDF reports. So how do we have an experience which is fully digitalized? So from the point upon which you receive an invitation to do an assessment, all the way through to the results being delivered and there being further outcomes for that. And that there is a platform which is in place for people to then keep on coming back to for those different use cases. That is incredibly important for us at LHH, and that we work towards delivering that value to our customers and clients, and that's what we were asking for from providers. The results delivery, so like how do we get to great results delivery and how to get to the point quickly, linking back to what do I really need to know for what the purpose of this assessment is for, how do I take that into a great next coaching conversation, line manager conversation, team interaction, whatever that may well be, and being able to do that in a quick, clear, concise way with great information related to that data is really important for us. And the last one, which may not necessarily relate to all different providers and customers, is for us client return on investment is huge. So one of the things that has been clear, I'd say probably in the market space for assessment now for some time, is that an assessment happens, it takes place, it delivers an outcome, and then at that point a PDF report is pushed in a drawer, someone goes on and has a coaching, potentially some level of coaching experience, but then that's a kind of augmented step beyond the assessment, and therefore the perceived value of that assessment is not as high as it could be. So how do we keep on injecting more return on investment into the customer experience is super critical for us. So like, how does that happen from the beginning, for the participant, for the stakeholders, for HR, and in terms of where that goes. So like, how does data keep on then being re-injected back into places where people work every day? That's a really important factor for us too.
Absolutely. And Rob, that's a really interesting way of sort of unpacking it. So with, science retains like it's number one, it needs to work, right?
Yes, of course.
But I think your last point is I think when I've seen evaluations and probably been on the other side of the fence pitching for things as well, that focus on value creation and not just in the moment but over time probably is sometimes overlooked, I think. So I think it's good to emphasize the importance of, can you demonstrate that ongoing ROI from the data that you're collecting in various different ways is a valuable lesson, I think.
And I think where providers are trying to work towards some of that is by going to platform as much as possible. So the platform is your ongoing ROI lever. When you need to come back to an intervention which is different from the first stage, so you were selecting somebody in a process, data is there on platform, that can now be transferred into a development or an onboarding plan for that person, which can then be translated into talent pooling in a year. Is that person ready for a next step onwards beyond that process? So that's where I see a lot of the provider market is going, is to push that kind of return on investment stages into platform and platform technology. Whilst I think that is certainly an answer, it's whether or not that actually delivers value to the person involved at the end. Is that really helping that person to move forward or not? And that comes down to things like adoption. Like, is it actually really well adopted within the organisation to keep on doing so? And for me, with the complexity of different levels of technology, the kind of advancement of HRIS, which has become very much a kind of sophisticated model for large organisations in the last decade, you need to be where people are every day to make things easier. There's been investments in, say, assessment tech getting to places like Teams. There's 320 million users or more now on Teams every day. Those are the types of places and destinations where access to new assessment tools, IP, tech development, and so on is going to need to exist for it to be adopted.
Yes, and interesting on that so the sort of info security and the sort of technology integration aspects, it sounded to me like they're more sort of table stakes things that you expect, they're not maybe the defining criteria, they're more well, this is bare minimum we want to see.
Yeah, well, that's important for us because that's often where a lot of our large customer base is, and that's where they are on their journey. So therefore, we certainly need to meet our customers where they are. Now, that may be entirely different for somebody who is, let's say, in-house HR, and they're looking at what they need to run theirs, like their organisation setup, their team sizes, their sophistication, where they are on your maturity curve, would all play into what do we really need to be able to fully adopt that and get the best value from a provider.
Yeah, so absolutely. So it's not happening in a vacuum. So when you think about the sort of I'm sure you will have seen a whole load of vendors, and then I know you had a sort of a final few that you reviewed. What across the pack, what things is the supply side strong at in your view, and where do you think maybe the areas that need most improvement?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think firstly, the first thing to play back is that they've all got their strengths and they've all got their drawbacks.
Sure.
As a result of their strategy. So, like we've already kind of discussed, I think there is a spectrum between science and technology. Between those two, there's possibly a maturity curve for between those two things
Indeed,
as well to evolve it over time. Some of the providers really rely on their science continuing to be their unique selling points. And that also is a lot about how their organization's been set up over the course of many decades. But that will continue to be their unique selling points. And a number of them would wipe the floor with any other provider in that space in terms of what they have. That was certainly what we were finding in some of the partner evaluations that they were doing, is they were significantly stronger in that space. And as we mentioned a bit earlier, some of the other providers have been on high growth trajectories with cash being injected by private equity, which means that they are moving to create organizations which are significantly more valuable for them because they are in a fund.
Yes.
And so therefore they're looking to grow their organizational value through injecting that into places within the organization, which creates a more valuable organization, which is often platform, intellectual property, and obviously how that then links and connects into recurring revenue. So therefore, there's a spectrum between the two things that I'm seeing, is that some organizations will be significantly stronger in technology, but they could be weaker in terms of their science and measurement behind that, because they're pushing all of their cash into that. And then conversely, some of the others I'd say are somewhat in the middle. So they're starting to creep into new innovative ways to drive great technology with great science. That's a really interesting space, which I think if they can continue to advance their product development and technology, they could end up becoming a clear winner in the market, potentially for, say, a given use case for assessments, though, in particular. So that's what's important to consider, is what are they great at? What's their market space like? Some are much better for the talent acquisition space and the kind of high volume recruiting space. Others will gravitate more so towards the senior leadership space. And that's what we were finding in the partner evaluation, is that they are good for certain use cases for certain levels behind that. So at the moment for us, technology is still really critically important. We need to be where people are every day. So we were finding those that have invested in technology are likely going to lead a little bit faster and quicker in the market space than others.
And it's interesting how you describe that. I mean, you mentioned customer need at the beginning, actually, and what that looks like. And to what extent do you think that either being, it may not be quite as polarized as this, but to what extent is being very scientifically purist, perhaps at one extreme, or also being very sort of investor-led at the other? To what extent are those helpful, or perhaps could get in the way of really being customer focused? I just wondered if you had a view on that.
I think getting a blend of both,
yeah, sure,
is what will set a lot of organizations up for good success related to that, and using the providers for what they're best for. There's certainly, as I mentioned, there is no one-stop shop, especially from an LHH point of view, in terms of the range of use cases, the clients that we work with, the different levels of sophistication related to that. Getting a blend of both is what's going to create a happy equilibrium between all of those for us. And that's what other customers should really kind of consider in that discussion, is about, well, what's most important for us to be able to do that. I will say that most of the organizations out there have always got a reasonable baseline for science. That's where all of the organizations started in the first place. So therefore, as long as that bedrock is still very much in place, but some have taken it to almost an extreme,
yes,
as being their unique selling points behind that, which, dependent upon what type of organization you've got, so is your organization focused more so on the innovation space, so therefore you want more innovative solutions, you're happy to take some, be early adopters with new platforms or potentially new products within that, there will be better partners that are wedded to your kind of culture of the organization. If you work, say, more in risk-averse markets, financial services markets tend to be more risk-averse, and they care about the risk that they put on their industry. And they may well gravitate more towards more tried and tested processes and mechanisms for them, because they feel that fits their business culture better. So that's also some of the things I think that people will really need to consider related to making that decision.
Yeah. In thinking, you mentioned about the one-stop shop question, actually, which is interesting. If let's say you're a large corporate and you've probably got a load of volume hiring and early career stuff to do, and then you will have lateral hiring, but then you've got talent and leadership assessment, across the whole piece. From what you've seen, to what extent are the suppliers you've reviewed able to really service all of that, or do you think it's probably a little bit more fragmented, really?
Yeah, it is more fragmented. In reality, it absolutely is. Some of the kind of bigger assessment players at the kind of high end of the executive spaces and the senior spaces. So that's a space that LHH plays in. Obviously, other providers like Korn Ferry do, and some of the other exec search practices also play in that sort of space. So Hydra, Spencer Stewart as well. But they will use the best of what's available on the market to then play their role well in terms of how they drive assessments within that. And lots of the organisations that I talk to use those providers for what they're best for. And that's just the way the current market still stands today. I still think that there will be in time, though, because a lot of the work that they do is qualitative work, will be starting to be challenged by the use of Gen AI as it gets better and better. Which is one of the advancements. Which I think we were going to talk a little bit later about that, but that's one of the things that I see
that's probably next on
coming.
the list, actually. Yes, about how do you see that innovation, future-proofing piece in Gen AI? How does that play?
Well, then let's kind of come back. Let's come back to that in a bit.
Yes.
But then at the other end of the market, with the talent acquisition side, there are obviously some key players that have been playing this for a long, long time, and that's obviously where their origins and strengths base are.
Absolutely.
And they also integrate tools that make things easier for like interviewing and question items and automation of recording and synthesis of content from that, which can then be fed back more easily into HRIS. And some of those players are also natively integrated in places like Workday these days as well, which again is a kind of, for those organizations that are making those choices that are large ones, I think they're also looking sometimes for the pathway of least resistance to be able to actually create a strategy that can be adopted, because the adoption is often the primary barrier. Is about how do we get line managers aligned to actually use a new provider. If there's a switch behind that adoption can take ages. It depends again what your culture's like in terms of working alongside those things. So that's what I think providers will be doing, is they're still using the providers out there for the best they can, but they're also trying to get the best value for money now out of those providers. Like, it's become more and more challenging, I'd say, over time. But large organizations will always be picking, I'd say, from a blend of at least two providers to be able to cover the majority of use cases with talent acquisition and talent management in different spectrums.
Yeah, so there's a sort of natural segmentation bit that probably flows off that. And I think, as we were just alluding to on the innovation front, the adoption question is quite a curious one, because clearly it will take anybody time to get all of your hiring managers to adopt. I mean, you may not ever get all of them, but you do your best to do that, right? Noting, let's say that might take several months to a year or whatever, given the rate of innovation more widely, not necessarily just in assessment, but more widely, how did you think about the sort of, making sure what you're buying into now is going to have enough room for maneuver in it to, allow you to adopt innovations that might come down the road?
Yeah, well, then that's one of the benefits that we have at LHH, is that whilst we have some intellectual property of our own, we leverage the best of what's available in the market space to do so. So we use their innovation and what they do and deliver to deliver what we need to do. So there is no reason why we can't turn around quickly if a new provider came to market and get that as part of our assessments in our stable to play a particular use case out for a given client or need. And we've done that time and time again over the course of many different decades. So that's a good.
Would you integrate that into your platform, or at least into your workflow? I guess, is that one of your criteria, really?
It would start off with workflow first, and then for me, in a global role, we have a global platform that we use to run our assessment processes. Within that, we would then evaluate how we would then connect that, if that's got the right relevance for us in terms of investment. Is there enough demand to do so? And how does it more seamlessly integrate into in particular into a development process for us? So, but that's what we're definitely in the global team. That's what I think about in terms of evaluating how that goes into that. We have to be a little bit careful though, because we could end up with a huge stable of options, but it actually then becomes quite cumbersome and not necessarily so easy to navigate and work with. And we need to make sure that we've got great use cases, great tools and assessments that people can clearly understand how that connects to a client need, and about what the client's issue is, and about how that then translates into why the assessments add value to that issue.
Yeah, so you've kind of got, you want a platform which has some innovation potential in and of itself, but also the capacity to absorb some things clearly on a selected basis as things evolve.
Yes, very much so. But it doesn't prevent us from saying, working with a new provider, if a new provider came to market, we could definitely secure a pathway to use that provider, and we could use that as part of a workflow process, just like you've outlined there, Alan. And that's part of the managed service process at LH.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's home in on the sort of decision-making piece. So you talked about the criteria and the sort of perhaps the landscape of the market. From your perspective, can you walk us through how you balance those things to kind of get to the right decision for you? In the follow-on is how somebody else might do that.
Yeah. So a few of them we've touched on a little bit. So we scored. So in our case, when we were looking at some of the recent partners, we did a scoring exercise. So, which is not necessarily any differently to how providers might do an RFP or an RFP process, but for us, scoring them in terms of their capabilities was most important. In my case for LHH, I tried not to put too much weighting on things like costs. So where RFP processes are classically driven out of HR teams to procure and provide that, cost has a significant weighting. There is a budget that needs to be met, so therefore that's obviously understandable. In our case, it's about what is the very best future innovation for us in terms of what the partners can bring, because we don't want to keep on having to change partners and providers frequently. We just want the best ones that are going to deliver the most value for us over the course of, say, a 3 or 5 year period.
Yes.
So that's one of the things is scoring process is really important. Peer reviews. So important to get objective peer review feedback in that process as well. Do they see things the same way that the original scorer has done so? Is there differences in there? Is there some level of calibration that can be applied? Again, that's really important. Helps with adoption, helps with communication, decision-making processes. There's external expertise as well. So like Alan, the type of work that you do at Amati and working with different customers down there, like de-risking your decision-making process is an important step that can be taken, which potentially is somewhat overlooked because there's often that's done through departments like procurement, but then they don't understand the solutions that there actually are, like what's the value of what's actually being procured is not necessarily translated all the way through the processes that organisations follow to buy a platform or a service provider. External expertise, again, can be incredibly valuable and important, especially if you feel that you have some blind spots related to doing so. And then the last one is still a practical one, which is what's the simplest pathway to implementation? Because implementation can take a lot of time. If it takes time to you to bring new providers on and it takes 6 months or longer to do so, often things like translations, links, testing, UX, once you kind of get into all of those different stages of potential development and implementation, that can take an awfully long time. And you've got to think about the adoption process. Is this going to get adopted well? Who are my stakeholders going to be around that? How am I going to use them to jump off as influencers for me to push that adoption through? And to make that selection choice a really good choice for your organisation. So those are the kind of 5 things that we've used and reflected on when we think about how to get to a good decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that, your organisational capacity to make the particular solution deliver value, I think is quite a nice way to sort of to view it, right? Which is definitely an interesting part of making the right decision. And you mentioned the assessment maturity matrix piece from the assessment maturity curve from earlier. I think I'm sort of interested in your take on if you're let's say an early stage organisation that hasn't done a lot of assessment, that's a rather different landscape to create adoption than it is if you've got a lot of legacy stuff there or processes that have been around for years.
Yes.
You've got unbuilding to do as well as building in the second scenario. So did you have a view on how that maturity level influences what the best answer might be?
Yeah. So there's a couple of, maybe I've not given this as much thought as I'd like to, but there's definitely a couple of points, which is, well, one, who are you serving? Like who is really using it and why is one of the most important factors to focus on. In our case at LHH, we have all of the use cases for assessments we have to think about. So therefore, other organisations won't necessarily have that level of complexity to consider. So think about what the core value is that needs to be driven. And in particular, what types of people are going to use that. So that will really help you make a decision about which of the providers have got their strength areas in those spaces. Do this with their eyes closed.
Yes.
That's the type of things that will definitely help people pick providers. That's kind of more the kind of simpler end use cases. For the more complex end of the market, so for the kind of more what I would call enterprise customers, they're going to be using possibly hundreds of thousands of tests per year in some of their cases, especially if you consider multiple assessments per candidate, per person. That type of multipliers are happening in that space. They're always going to need a blend of different assessments from different providers to do so. And they've got to think about kind of predominantly what's their kind of technology play and about how does that need to interact and interplay with the employee base so that they're able to get that data into the hands of people easily, quickly, with great insights behind that. All of the providers will claim that they can provide a level of integration that will connect into their ecosystems. I find that when you actually talk to those providers, the process behind that can be wildly different in terms of application, and that depends upon their legacy, what they've invested in, what their status is with various partners behind that. That's really important to explore. And the other thing that we haven't talked about, Alan, which is also some of the what I call positive disruptors in this space as well, players like Eightfold, for example, in the whole kind of talent market space and analytics space and skills space, they are now also integrating into the ecosystems that large customers are looking for. And that's how they're going to answer some of their questions related to skills and skills taxonomy. And that's, I would say, some of the kind of new positive disruption is about. If you're going to be using some of those technology providers, there are only some of them that are ready to actually try and integrate with that space yet. So that's a very kind of careful consideration is about what's your kind of critical pathway to the employee or the customer.
Yes, and to that point, Rob, there's an element like you mentioned about the skills-based piece and the likes of Eightfold and others. There's an evolution in the ecosystem you need to integrate into, right? From it's not just integrate into an ATS workflow, start here, finish there. It's become more how do you integrate your data into that space, which is a more
exactly. Process. And like Workday is, at least in face value, has started to become one of the predominant player in HRIS. I'm seeing more and more of that kind of coming up in the conversations that I'm having. And some players are also now trying to integrate directly into their skills cloud space. So assessment data directly linking into the skills cloud space. So that in itself could be a really kind of easy way for actual insight from assessments to pull into the skills cloud. So if organizations have that type of strategy, looking for those clear links, asking the providers to demonstrate that value to you, do not accept that it works. Actually ask for it to see it working with your use case so that you're able to make a fair and obviously informed decision about if that's going to work for your strategy.
Yeah, so seeing is believing, I think, on that one, isn't it? Rather than
it is in my eyes, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been really helpful to sort of unpack, the considerations, the journey, and the decision-making components, and the balance of, science, the digital experience, the delivery of results, and then driving value, like you described. If you were to sort of sum up, Rob, for everybody listening, what would your sort of final piece of advice be for anyone else who's looking at buying an assessment platform for their organisation?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of different foods for thought in terms of what you might think. So firstly, always evaluate the suppliers thoroughly. Do not make any assumptions about them, even if you work with them today. So think about what really matters to the end user and how do you keep on getting more and more value from assessments. Assessments often have at least validity that's somewhere often in the range of 18 months to 2 years. Other providers will happily tell you that it's longer than that as well, and they can prove that. So think about how you can thoroughly assess them and how much value you can get out of them on a long-term basis. Think about the backdrop of what's happening with those providers today, like have a very kind of clear look at what's happening to them financially, strategic direction, ask them for their roadmaps and say, paint a picture for what it's going to be like to work with you in a year's time. And they will be able to provide you with some lenses to look through there to see what that can look and feel like. Some will be more revealing than others. You'll be surprised in terms of what you can get from that. And lastly, kind of mentioned it a number of times, is you've just got to focus on where the value is going to a candidate, to a leader, to a team. That is the most important part. Even if that costs you that small amount of extra money, that can make or break the difference related to adoption and about people having a great experience. And that extra £10 per test or whatever that might look like is money well spent if that is recognised at the end.
Absolutely. Well, in that focus on value that you sort of tuned into a few times, I think is a really important, probably a good place to finish on. Actually, that's really about bringing all of those different factors together to get the right outcome. So, Rob, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alan.